To begin the installation of your wing skins, the best way to start here is going to be to have another person help you flip the entire wing skeleton upside down so that the underside of the wing is facing up. The first skins that we're going to install will be the bottom skins, and this is going to be by far the easiest way to make sure everything is lining up properly and fitting together properly. So as you can see here, as usual, I've got all the parts unwrapped, deburred, cleaned, and dimpled where necessary. Not shown here is the lower stringer is already in place here. Just remember that the channel opening faces away from the main spar. In addition to that, you're going to have your 3 for the left wing and 2 for the right wing inspection hatch grip plates here, unwrapped, dimpled, and cleaned up also. Just remember that the largest hole on both the skin and these plates does not get dimpled. This is actually just a pass-through hole for the bolt to pass through to lock in your actual inspection plate covers. Another thing to make note of is these you'll want to rivet onto the underside of all 3 ports before you cleco and rivet your skins in. It just makes it a lot easier to access it and make sure it's all fitting together. And on the left and right wing, the far outboard inspection port, there's actually a little bit of an interference between the hinge bracket plate here and this rivet. So let me give you a close-up of that. So here we're looking at the far outboard inspection hatch, and this goes for both wings, as I mentioned earlier. It's only this one hole, so what I'm about to say only pertains to this one hole on each wing. There's an interference with the rivet being able to pass through and mount your inspection port grip plate onto the back here. As you can see, there's that interference with this channel below. So actually the problem is that even after this 8mm rivet is pulled, the tail of the rivet is still going to interfere with that channel. So you have 2 options. One option is to source a shorter countersunk rivet, or the easier option, the quicker option, is actually to gently remove the mandrel from the body of the rivet. And with a rotary tool, trim back the body of the rivet, either to the first notch or just slightly past that, to shorten the body of the rivet and then reinstall it onto the mandrel. That'll allow when you do pull that rivet, there's less material behind it on the tail, and that'll fix this interference with this channel here. If you don't do that, you'll just end up with a very slight flare up in your skins and potentially a little bit of difficulty installing and removing your inspection hatch plate covers. Now that we've got our inspection hatch grip plates installed into all 3 inspection hatches, it's time to begin clecoing and then riveting the skins into position. Remember, by far the easiest way to do this is cleco your main spar and your rear spar into position first. So place the clecos first fairly well spread out along each spar, and then fill them in, and then move on to your ribs. This is because the jig can allow for a little bit of shifting in this direction. So you want to lock in that shift before you go into clecoing your ribs into position. Once everything is clecoed in and seems to be lining up properly, you can begin riveting. So now that we've got our bottom skins riveted onto the wing here, there's a couple things to make note of. First is, because of that shift that I mentioned earlier that the jig allows before this step is complete, you just really want to make sure that all of your holes on your rear spar and your main spar are lining up perfectly. There shouldn't really be any need for match drilling these holes. And if there is, it's most likely because your jig is just slightly torqued on the table there. So something to make note of for this step is we're going to leave the rivets behind the rear spar here on the trailing edge of the bottom skin off for now. That's because when we put on our root skin on the top, it actually has a little lip that curves around and underneath this skin. So To do that, because these rivets are still off, all I have to do is remove these clecos, lift the skin up slightly, and allow that curve to get underneath this skin here, and that way we don't have that little edge here. We've just got a nice straight aerodynamic surface here. In addition to that, we're going to leave off the rivets from this point where the main spar starts with 2 angles down to 1 angle here. From this point to the tip of the wing, we're going to leave all of these rivets off the main spar for now, because these are going to be used to mount your leading edge skin, as well as this section here from this rib over to the main spar is going to be used to mount your fuel tanks later. In addition to that, don't forget your doubler plates. These are just reinforcement plates that go on the underside of the main spar here, because the spar is thinner out here, and so your countersink may have enlarged that hole just slightly, so this gives those rivets something to really grip onto. For now, I have this off because I'm going to need to remove these clecos anyway to install the leading edge skin, but don't forget to install this when the time comes to actually install these rivets, and these go on the far tip of both the top and the bottom of the main spar. So the next step is we're going to flip the entire assembly back over, and we're going to install our pitot tube, as well as the lines for pitot and angle of attack, and all the wiring for the heated pitot tube, as well as your landing and taxi lights and your wingtip strobe. So now we've got all of our wires and tubing run through this left wing here. A couple of things to make note of. Most of it's fairly straightforward, so I'll just go over that part really quick. The 6-core shielded wire, as well as the 16-gauge white Teflon wire, those run down through your center wing stringer here, and they go out. The 6-core goes to your nav light, and the 2 white wires go to your landing and taxi lights. So I ground them to the airframe ground at the taxi light location, but you can, if you want to, run an additional ground wire back to the fuselage. So once you've run those wires, you'll just use these zip ties through the holes that are nicely placed for you to secure the wire within this stringer, and everything should be good to go. Of course, install the grommets for all of this everywhere that they're required before you run your wires, because you won't be able to get them installed, and leave enough extra length on each end so that you have more than enough to work with. It's always easier to cut off wire than add more later. So this particular build has a heated and regulated pitot tube. So one trick with that is it's going to have the regulator unit, which needs to be mounted near the pitot tube itself. So I've built this rack mount for it to mount easily to the rib with 4 riv nuts to install it and remove it easily with just 4 screws. You can install it to the inspection hatch plate itself, but I like this option better because then when you remove the plate, you don't have any components hard mounted to it. So then make sure all of your wires are nicely secured. The push rod slides directly through the center of all of your rib holes, this front round hole here. And you want to make sure that there's no interference with any of the components with that push rod, because over time you'll wear through your wires or wear through your pitot tubes, and of course that would not be good. So as you can see here, the pitot tube from Garmin specifically comes with 2 very long metal tubes coming out the top of it, and you're going to need to trim those off. So I trim the front, the forwardmost tube is your pitot, and the rear tube is your angle of attack indicator. So the way I do that is I trim the front one so it's about 1 inch longer than the rear one. So that way you've got access to both and everything's very easy to assemble. And then you install tie wire at least 2 places. I've got 3 on the pitot and 2 on the angle of attack to make sure that that tube is really well sealed onto the metal tube. So there are other kits that are available to make these connections a little bit easier. This is what the Sling kit comes with, and it's perfectly sufficient as long as it's done properly. Another thing to make note of is the metal tubes that come out of the top of your pitot are actually very soft and malleable. If you have a tube bender or even just gently by hand, you're able to slightly bend them so that there's enough space between them to get both hoses on, as well as so that they're slightly angled just a way to make sure that you're keeping clear of your aileron push rod. And so from there, you just make sure everything's nicely secured so that there's no risk of it ever moving in flight, so that you can guarantee that there's no abrasion between those, and everything should be good to go. In addition to that, I like to install these standoffs between the pitot and angle of attack tubes and the wires. This makes sure that just in between here, nothing can jostle around and potentially droop or sag or get out of position. And it just makes things a little bit more secure down the road. Because it is inside the wing, it's really difficult to access. So doing that now is a better step. So I just use little clips of the PVC tubing to make the standoff, and then a zip tie around that, and everything is held nice and securely. So the next step is we're going to install our top wing skins. As you can see, the top skins have all been installed onto the wing now. Of course, as always, they were unwrapped, deburred, cleaned, and dimpled where necessary. The only dimpling that needs to be done for this step are the 4mm rivets along the main spar and one 3.2mm rivet at the end. This process, though very time-consuming, is fairly straightforward and easy. Just like with the bottom skins, just make sure to start by clecoing your main spar and your rear spar, and then everything should line up properly and make it very easy to get the clecos into the ribs and install all your rivets. One thing to make note of for this particular step is the section of this far trailing edge row of rivets here that's going to be for your flap, which is marked by this small notch here, all the way down to the root right here. All of these rivets, the kit comes with 3.2 by 6mm rivets that aren't the traditional multi-grip that's used everywhere else. If you use those rivets here, there's going to be less interference with the rivet tail between your flaps when they're fully retracted. This gap is very, very tight when the flaps are fully retracted for better aerodynamics in flight. However, the 3.2 by 8mm standard multi-grip rivets, the rivet tails will have some slight interference with your flap when it's fully retracted. So these 3.2 by 6mm rivets really help to alleviate that issue. The section from this notch here outwards is for your aileron, and there's not the same issue with interference between the standard 3.2 by 8mm rivets and your aileron. Here we're looking at the bottom side of the wing root, and as I mentioned earlier, we left off these rivets on the bottom here so that we're able to get the top root skin underneath the bottom root skin. And so now that we've got the top root skin in position, as you can see, I have installed the rivets onto the underside. Now it's time to install the leading edge skin onto the wing. A couple things to make note of here before you assemble it are: remember to install your retaining strips on the inside of the main spar, top and bottom. Remember to install the 8 riv nuts into your landing light rib here. It's very difficult to access that after the skin is in place. Also, we're going to leave off of all the rivets on this rib here, top and bottom. The fuel tank's going to use these holes to align and mount into all of these holes on the main spar here to here, and this rib. And so when it comes time to install the skin here, the best way to do it is to make sure that you get this tie down notch here onto the hook first and install it upwards from the bottom and wrap it around to the top. If you try to go from the top down, it may seem easier, but you're not going to be able to get that notch over the hook. And the last thing before our wing is complete for this part of the process is we're going to assemble our inspection plates. The first step here is to put the clear plastic film over the plate before dimpling. Then you can trim off the edges and make it nice and flush around there. And then you can move to dimpling. If you dimple first, it gets really hard to get the plastic to kind of conform to those dimples. I find that this way is much easier to do. Also, keep in mind to install your riv nut here before you've riveted the inspection plate to the grip plate here. You can do it afterwards, but it's just a lot easier to access before they're connected. And lastly, As you can see, I've got 6 rivets holding this grip plate on, or the inspection plate, and I've left these 2 holes clear. This is so that we can use a tool with 2 pins to install and remove this inspection plate. Because the countersunk rivets here, it's really difficult to find anything to grab onto. All right, so now this portion of the wing build is complete with our leading edge skin installed. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, to leave off the rivets where your fuel tank's going to attach. And we've got our inspection plates all on the underside of the wing installed nicely. So leave the wing on the jigs for now if you've got room for it. It's going to make it a lot easier when it comes time to build your fuel tanks, and we'll address that in another video. But one portion of that is to fit it onto the wing before actually riveting the assembly together so it all fits together nicely. So for now, we're complete.